Dear friends, join us for a serene journey into the world of ancient legends, where courage and fate intertwine in a grand Viking saga. Set aside daily worries, settle in comfortably, and let this story warm your heart. If it resonates with you, please like and subscribe to the channel. Your support inspires me to create more such tales. Imagine a cold morning on the rugged coast of Scandinavia, where the sea whispers its secrets and the wind carries the scent of salt and pine resin. It was the year 793, though for the people of that land, time was measured not by calendars but by seasons. Long winters when fires burned in longhouses, and short summers when the sun barely dipped below the horizon. In a small settlement nestled among the fjords of Norway, where cliffs plunged into the water and the sky often hid behind grey clouds, lived a man named Eric. He was no king or great warrior, just a farmer who tended his sheep and fished in the icy waters. His hands were rough from handling ropes and axes, his face weathered by the wind that blew in from the North Sea. That morning, Eric awoke to the sound of waves crashing against the rocks, louder than usual. The sun was just rising, painting the water in shades of pink and gold, but the air carried a chill that hinted at the coming winter. He stepped out of his hut, built of thick logs and covered with sod, where the embers of last night's fire still smouldered. The smell of roasted fish and barley bread lingered, mingling with the fresh dew on the grass. Eric stretched, feeling the ache in his muscles from yesterday's labor. He had spent the day chopping wood, preparing for the cold months ahead. His wife, Inga, still slept inside with their 2 young sons, boys who dreamed of adventure while listening to tales by the fire. But something felt off. Eric walked to the shore, where his boat, a simple wooden dracker with a curved prow carved into a dragon's head, bobbed on the waves. He noticed a glint in the water, as if something metallic caught the first rays of dawn. Kneeling, he pulled from the sand an ancient silver bracelet, etched with runes that spoke of old gods. It wasn't from their village. Its intricate design suggested it came from distant lands, perhaps the south. Eric rubbed it against the sleeve of his woolen tunic, feeling the cold metal against his skin. His heart quickened. Was this a sign from Odin, god of wisdom and war, or merely a lost trinket from a wayward traveler? He returned to the hut, clutching the find. Inga was awake now, stirring the fire and adding dry branches to heat a pot of oat porridge mixed with dried berries. The smoke rose, blending with the earthy scent of the hearth, creating that cozy aroma that always meant home. "Look what I found," Eric said softly, so as not to wake the children. Inga took the bracelet, her eyes widening. "This isn't ours," she whispered. "Maybe from England or Ireland. I've heard skalds tell of rich monasteries there, where gold flows like rivers." Eric nodded, feeling a spark ignite in his chest, not fear but anticipation. In their world, where the land was poor and harvests meager, such a find whispered of possibility, voyages across the sea, where treasures and glory awaited. That same day, Eric went to see the village jarl, old Thorstein, who lived in a larger hut atop a hill. The jarl was a seasoned warrior, scarred from battles with neighboring tribes, his beard as grey as the mountain snow. They sat by the fire in his hall, where shields and swords hung on the walls, and the air was thick with the scent of mead and roasted meat. Eric showed him the bracelet, and Thorstein examined it closely, his eyes gleaming. "This is from a monastery," he said slowly. "I've heard from traders of islands in Britain where monks hoard gold and silver in their shrines. They're weak, unarmed, and their gods don't protect them like ours, Thor and Odin." Their talk stretched late, and Eric felt the jarl's words kindle a fire within him. They spoke of hungry winters, when sheep died in the cold and children cried from empty bellies. "Our land is spent," Thorstein said, "but the sea is open. If we gather men, build ships, we can take what we need." That small find, the bracelet on the shore, became a spark. That evening, the village gathered in the hall, men with axes at their belts, women with children in their arms. The fire crackled, casting shadows on their faces, while a skald sang ancient sagas of heroes who sailed across seas in drakars. His voice was low and rhythmic, like the pulse of waves, recounting tales of Ragnar Lothbrok, who ventured to far lands and returned with riches. Eric sat among them, holding the bracelet, his heart beating in time with the drum. Inga clutched his hand, her fingers warm but her eyes anxious. "What if you don't return?" she whispered later, as they lay in their bed of furs, listening to the wind outside. Eric held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, salt and herbs. "We'll return richer," he replied, "for our sons, for a better life." The days that followed became a whirlwind of preparation. The village, once content with its quiet rhythm, fishing at dawn, fieldwork by day, and stories at night, now buzzed with energy. Men felled trees in the forest, where the air was heavy with the scent of fresh resin and moss. Axes flashed in the sunlight, their rhythmic thuds echoing like the heartbeat of the earth. They built a new drakar, a long, sleek ship of oak planks bound with iron nails. Its prow was carved with a dragon to ward off sea spirits. Eric worked alongside them, sweat beading on his brow, muscles aching, yet filled with the joy of shared purpose. At midday they ate simple meals, salted fish, barley bread, and cheese from their sheep's milk. The taste was briny and tough, but it fueled them, a reminder of survival. The women, like Inga, prepared provisions, drying meat, filling barrels with water, sewing sails from coarse cloth. Children ran about, wielding wooden swords in mock battles, their laughter ringing through the noise. But not all was bright. One evening, as the sun sank behind the fjord, painting the water blood-red, Eric overheard an argument. Two men, young Halvar and old Olaf, clashed over the risks. "We're not warriors," Olaf said, his voice trembling with age. "The sea will take us, as it took my brother last year." Halvar, eyes blazing, shot back. "Better to die in adventure than starve here." Eric stepped in, placing a hand on Olaf's shoulder. "We go not for death, but for life," he said calmly. Yet that night, lying awake, he felt doubts creep in. What if the sea did claim them? What if the foreign lands were hostile? Meanwhile, word of the bracelet spread. Traders arriving on horseback from neighboring fjords heard of the find and brought their own tales. One, a bearded Dane named Bjorn, spoke of a monastery on an island called Lindisfarne, where monks wrote books on parchment adorned with gold and prayed to their single god. "They're defenseless as lambs," Bjorn said, sipping mead from a horn. His words were like honey, sweet and tempting. Eric pictured those lands. Green hills, bountiful harvests, treasures in stone buildings. It was a stark contrast to their harsh reality. Rocky fields where barley barely grew, winters when wolves howled at the door. Jarl Thorstein called a council. They sat in a circle around a great fire, its flames dancing, casting warm light on their faces. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and roasted venison, dripping fat onto the coals. "We sail in spring," the Jarl declared. "Eric will lead one of the ships, for Odin sent him the sign." Eric felt a surge of pride mixed with fear. He wasn't born a leader, but this find had changed everything. That night, gazing at the stars glittering above the fjord like diamonds on black velvet, he thought of the future. The wind whispered promises of adventure, but also warnings of danger. Weeks passed, and the village transformed. New ships lined the shore, their sails billowing in the breeze. Men trained with swords and shields, their shouts echoing over the water. Eric taught his sons to fish, telling them of the gods, Thor with his hammer, striking lightning, and Loki, the cunning trickster. Inga sang ancient songs, her voice soft as silk, about love and parting. But tension hung in the air. The hunger of last winter had claimed several elders, and all remembered the taste of thin gruel when stores ran dry. At last, the day of departure arrived. The morning was clear, the sky as blue as Inga's eyes. Eric stood on the Draka's deck, feeling the ship sway beneath him. The water lapped at the hull, salty and cold. Inga kissed him, her tears warm on his cheeks. "Come back with treasures," she whispered. The men rowed, muscles straining, and the ships pulled away from the shore. The village shrank, the fjords faded, and ahead lay the endless sea. Eric gazed at the horizon, the bracelet tucked in his pocket. This small find had set off a ripple, not just for him, but for his people. He felt the stirrings of something grand, an era of voyages, discoveries, battles, and glory. But what lay beyond the sea? Would they find riches, or only death? The wind filled the sails, and the ship surged forward, carrying the fates of many. And so, in the quiet rhythm of the waves, the story of the Vikings began, with a single find on a shore, awakening dreams and fears. Ahead lay a migration, as ideas and people would spread like wind across the sea. The sea stretched endlessly before Eric's Draka, a vast expanse of grey-green waves that rolled under a sky heavy with clouds. It was spring of 793, and the air carried the sharp tang of salt, mixed with the faint mustiness of damp wood from the ship's hull. The sails snapped in the wind, their coarse linen straining against the ropes, and the oars dipped rhythmically into the water, pulled by men whose breath came in steady huffs. Eric stood at the prow, his hands gripping the dragon-carved figurehead, feeling the spray on his face, cold, bracing, alive. His woolen cloak was damp, clinging to his shoulders, and the scent of tar used to seal the ship's planks lingered in his nose. The bracelet, that silver spark that had set this journey in motion, rested heavy in his pocket, a reminder of the gamble they had taken. The village was now a distant memory, its fjords and longhouses swallowed by the horizon. Eric's heart ached for Inga and their sons, for the warmth of their hearth where the fire's smoke curled upward, carrying the smell of roasted mutton and barley porridge. But there was no turning back. The fleet, 3 Drakas, each carrying 20 men, sailed toward the unknown, driven by tales of riches in the lands of the Angles and Saxons. The men whispered of monasteries overflowing with gold, of fields greener than their rocky homeland, of a life where hunger didn't gnaw at their children's bellies. Yet the sea was a fickle ally, its waves whispering both promise and peril. The first days were grueling. The men rowed when the wind faltered, their hands blistering on the oars, muscles burning under the strain. At night, they huddled under woolen blankets, the chill seeping into their bones despite the furs they wrapped around themselves. Meals were sparse, dried cod, tough as leather, chewed slowly to make it last, and flatbread that tasted of ash from the fire it was baked over. Water, stored in oak barrels, had a faint woody tang, and they rationed it carefully, knowing the sea could turn cruel. Eric shared his portion with young Halvar, whose youthful bravado had begun to wane under the weight of the journey. "Eat," Eric said, pressing a piece of bread into the boy's hand. Halvar's fingers were cold, his knuckles red from the oars. "We'll need your strength when we reach land." The men sang to keep their spirits high, their voices rising over the creak of the ship and the slap of waves. The songs were old, passed down from fathers to sons, tales of Thor battling giants, of Odin's ravens soaring over the world. The melodies were deep and mournful, yet they carried a fire that warmed the heart. Eric joined in, his voice rough but steady, and for a moment the vastness of the sea felt less daunting. The stars above glittered like frost, and the moon cast a pale glow, turning the waves into a shimmering path. Yet beneath the song, Eric sensed unease. Old Olaf, his grey beard tucked into his cloak, muttered prayers to Njord, the sea god, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of storms. As days turned to weeks, the fleet passed other ships, traders from Denmark, their vessels laden with furs and amber, who shouted greetings across the water. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, a trader named Sven rowed close. His boat smelled of pitch and dried herring, and his face was lined from years at sea. "You're bound for the Western Isles, aren't you?" he called, his voice carrying over the waves. Thorstein, standing on his own drakkar, nodded. Sven grinned, revealing a missing tooth. "Lindisfarne's monks have treasures, but their shores are rocky. Watch the tides, or your ships will splinter." He tossed a small sack across the gap. Dried apples, tart and sweet, a rare treat. Eric caught it, the fruit's faint aroma stirring memories of autumn harvests back home. Sven's words spread like ripples. The men whispered of Lindisfarne, their voices a mix of greed and fear. Eric overheard Halvar boasting to another rower, Leif, about the gold they'd carry home. "We'll fill our halls with silver," Halvar said, his eyes bright. Leif, older and quieter, chewed his bread slowly. "Gold's heavy," he said, "and foreign lands have men who'll fight for it." Eric said nothing, but his hand drifted to the bracelet in his pocket, its runes cold under his fingers. He wondered if the monks of Lindisfarne had warriors, or if their god would shield them as Thorstein claimed he wouldn't. The journey wasn't just across water. It was a migration of dreams, fears, and ambitions. Word of their voyage had already spread back home, carried by traders to other fjords. Eric imagined Inga hearing tales of their progress, her hands busy weaving, her heart torn between hope and dread. Other villages, inspired by the bracelet's promise, were building their own ships, their men dreaming of glory. The idea of wealth beyond the sea was like a fever, infecting the Norse lands. Eric saw it in the eyes of his crew. Men who had once been content with fishing and farming now spoke of conquest, their voices tinged with a hunger that hadn't been there before. One night, under a sky heavy with stars, the fleet anchored near a small island to rest. The men built a fire on the rocky shore, its flames licking at the darkness, sending up sparks that mingled with the salt air. They roasted a small seal they'd caught, its fat sizzling as it dripped into the fire, filling the air with a rich, oily scent. The meat was tough but warm, a relief after days of dried rations. They passed around a horn of mead, its honeyed sweetness cutting through the salt on their lips. Thorstein stood, his shadow long in the firelight, and spoke of their goal. "We're not just seeking gold," he said, his voice steady as stone. "We're building a future. Our children won't starve. Our names will live in sagas." The men cheered, but Eric noticed Olaf's silence, his eyes fixed on the sea. The island was a brief respite, but it revealed the human cost of their journey. One man, Gunnar, fell ill, his coughs rattling through the night. His wife had died in the last winter, and he joined the voyage to escape his grief. Eric sat with him, offering water, feeling the man's fevered brow. "I wanted to bring back something for my daughter," Gunnar whispered, his voice weak. Eric squeezed his shoulder, the weight of leadership settling heavier on him. He thought of his own sons, their small hands clutching wooden swords, and prayed he'd return to see them grow. As they sailed on, the sea grew rougher. A storm rolled in, the sky turning black as charcoal, the wind howling like a pack of wolves. The drakkars pitched violently, waves crashing over the decks, soaking the men in icy water that stung their skin. Eric tied himself to the mast, shouting orders over the roar. "Hold the oars! Keep the sail tight!" The men obeyed, their faces grim, their hands slipping on the wet wood. Lightning cracked, illuminating the dragon prows, and for a moment Eric thought he saw Thor himself in the clouds, hammer raised. The storm passed by dawn, leaving the fleet battered but intact. The men were quiet, their bravado dampened, their clothes heavy with seawater. Eric's throat was raw from shouting, his body aching, but he felt a strange pride. They had faced the sea and survived. Land appeared on the horizon days later, a low green line under a grey sky. The men's spirits lifted, their voices rising in song again, though hoarser now. Eric tasted salt on his lips, felt the ache in his hands from gripping the ropes. The air was different here, warmer, with a faint sweetness of grass carried on the breeze. Thorstein called the fleet together, their ships bobbing close. "That's Northumbria," he said, pointing to the shore. "Lindisfarne lies there. We'll strike at dawn, when the monks are at prayer." His words were met with nods, but Eric saw doubt in some eyes. Olaf's, Leif's, even young Halvar's. The bracelet had brought them here, but what would they find? Gold or blood? That night they anchored offshore, the waves gentler now, lapping at the hulls. The men ate their last rations, stale bread and dried fish, the taste bitter but sustaining. They sharpened their axes, the scrape of stone on metal a steady rhythm. Eric sat with Halvar, who clutched his axe like a talisman. "What if they fight?" Halvar asked, his voice low. Eric thought of Inga, of the bracelet, of the hunger that drove them. "We do what we must," he said, though the words felt heavy. He looked out at the dark sea, the stars reflected like scattered coins. The idea that had begun with a single find was now a tide, carrying not just their fleet but their people toward a new era. Tomorrow they would step onto foreign soil, and the world would shift. The dawn was near, and with it, the promise of glory or ruin. Eric closed his eyes, the bracelet cold in his hand, and wondered what stories the skalds would sing of this day. The dawn broke over the shores of Northumbria, a thin line of gold creeping across the horizon, where the sea met the green hills of Lindisfarne. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet grass and the faint musk of seaweed strewn across the rocky beach. Eric's drakkar rocked gently in the shallow waters, its dragon prow casting a shadow on the waves. The men were silent, their breaths visible in the chill morning air, their hands gripping axes and shields. The taste of last night's meal, stale flatbread and dried cod, lingered bitterly on Eric's tongue, a reminder of the meager rations that had sustained them through weeks at sea. His body ached from days of rowing, his fingers stiff from the cold, but his heart pounded with a mix of fear and anticipation. The monastery of Lindisfarne lay just beyond the dunes, its stone walls barely visible through the morning mist. The men disembarked, their boots sinking into the pebbled shore, the crunch of stones underfoot mingling with the soft lapping of waves. Eric felt the weight of his axe at his belt, its handle worn smooth from years of use, and the bracelet in his pocket, its runes a quiet promise of purpose. Thorstein, the Jarl, led the way, his grey beard tucked into his cloak, his eyes scanning the land like a hawk. The crew moved swiftly, their steps light but deliberate, as if the earth itself might betray them. The air was alive with new smells, damp earth, blooming heather, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers, unlike the harsh salt and pine of their homeland. Eric inhaled deeply, the unfamiliar scents grounding him in this foreign place. They reached the monastery by mid-morning, its stone walls rising stark against the green hills. The building was unlike anything Eric had seen, not the wooden longhouses of home, but a fortress of grey stone, its arches carved with strange patterns. Bells rang softly, their chime carrying a mournful note, and the scent of incense drifted from within, sharp and resinous. The monks, clad in rough brown robes, were at prayer, their voices rising in a chant that felt alien to Eric's ears, so different from the rhythmic sagas of the skalds. Thorstein raised a hand, signaling silence, and the men crouched behind a low hill, their breath held, their bodies tense. Eric's stomach growled, a reminder of the hunger that had driven them here. The last full meal in the village, barley stew with mutton, its warmth filling the longhouse with the aroma of herbs, felt like a lifetime ago. The raid was swift and brutal. Thorstein's shout broke the silence, and the men surged forward, their axes gleaming in the weak sunlight. The monks scattered, their chants turning to cries of fear. Eric's heart raced as he ran, his boots slipping on the dew-slicked grass. Inside the monastery, the air was thick with the smell of old parchment, wax candles, and polished wood. Golden crosses and silver chalices glinted on an altar, their beauty stark against the chaos. Eric grabbed a chalice, its weight surprising him, its surface cool and smooth. He stuffed it into a sack, his hands trembling, not from fear, but from the rush of taking what wasn't his. Halvar, beside him, hacked at a wooden chest, revealing scrolls and a small box of jewels that sparkled like stars. The men moved like a storm, taking what they could carry, their shouts echoing in the stone halls. But survival demanded more than plunder. As they retreated to the ships, their sacks heavy with treasure, Eric noticed the monk's garden, rows of cabbages, onions, and herbs, their earthy scent mingling with the salt air. He tore up a handful of carrots, their dirt clinging to his fingers, and bit into one. The crunch was loud in his ears, the taste sweet and fresh, a stark contrast to the dry fish of the voyage. "Take what you can," he called to the men, and they stuffed their sacks with vegetables, their hunger outweighing their greed for gold. Back at the ships, they lit a fire on the beach, the crackle of burning driftwood mixing with the sea's rhythm. They boiled the stolen vegetables in a pot, the steam rising with a savory aroma that made Eric's mouth water. The broth was thin but warm, and as he sipped it, the heat spread through his chest, easing the ache of the journey. Night fell, and the men camped on the shore, their fire a beacon in the darkness. The sky was clear, stars scattered like grains of salt, and the air carried the scent of smoke and roasted roots. They ate greedily, the carrots and onions soft and sweet, a luxury after weeks of hardship. Eric sat with Leif, the quiet rower, who chewed slowly, his eyes distant. "This land is rich," Leif said, his voice low. "But we're strangers here. They'll come for us." Eric nodded, feeling the weight of the chalice in his sack. The monks had fled, but word of the raid would spread. Survival meant moving quickly, staying unseen. The days that followed were a blur of movement. The fleet sailed along the coast, raiding small settlements, taking grain, livestock, and tools. Each village had its own smells, freshly baked bread in one, the sour tang of fermenting ale in another. Eric's crew grew accustomed to the rhythm of survival, strike at dawn, take what they needed, and vanish into the sea. They slept in shifts on the ships, their bodies curled under furs, the rocking of the waves a strange comfort. Eric dreamed of Inga, her hands kneading dough, the smell of barley bread filling their hut. He woke to the taste of salt on his lips, the reality of their mission pulling him back. But survival wasn't just about food or plunder. The men's spirits needed tending. One evening, as they anchored in a quiet cove, the air heavy with the scent of pine from the nearby forest, Halvar began to sing. His voice was young but strong, carrying a saga of a hero who tamed the sea. The men joined in, their voices blending with the crackle of the fire and the distant cry of gulls. Eric felt the song anchor him, a thread connecting him to home. He thought of his sons, their small voices mimicking the skalds, and wondered if they'd sing of him one day. The fire's warmth seeped into his bones, and for a moment the weight of leadership lifted. Yet the harsh realities of survival crept in. Gunnar's cough worsened, his face pale under the firelight. Eric boiled herbs from the monk's garden, mint and thyme, their sharp scent rising in the steam, but they did little to ease the man's fever. "I should have stayed," Gunnar whispered one night, his voice barely audible over the waves. Eric held his hand, feeling the frailty of his grip, and promised to carry his share of treasure back to his daughter. When Gunnar died at dawn, they wrapped him in a sailcloth and set him adrift, a quiet offering to the sea. The men stood in silence, the weight of loss settling over them like fog. Eric tasted salt, not just from the sea, but from tears he didn't know he'd shed. The raids continued, but the men grew weary. Their hands blistered from oars, their bodies ached from carrying heavy sacks. The food they stole, barley, apples, smoked fish, kept them alive, but it was never enough. Eric rationed carefully, his own hunger a constant gnaw. One morning they found a village abandoned, its hearths cold, the air thick with the smell of charred wood. The villagers had fled, taking their food, leaving only a few sacks of grain. Eric's crew ate a thin porridge, its taste bland but filling, and he felt the first stirrings of doubt. Were they hunters, or were they becoming the hunted? As they sailed on, the landscape changed. Green hills gave way to rugged cliffs, the air sharper with the scent of salt and stone. They encountered other Norse ships, their crews carrying tales of their own raids. Word of Lindisfarne had spread, a spark igniting others to follow. Eric realized their journey was no longer just theirs. It was part of a larger tide, a movement of people seeking survival beyond their barren lands. The bracelet, that small find, had become a symbol, whispered about in villages far beyond their fjord. Eric felt its weight in his pocket, a reminder of how one moment could ripple outward, changing lives. One night, as they camped on a rocky beach, the fire casting shadows on the cliffs, Thorstein spoke of their next move. "We've taken enough to return," he said, his voice steady. "But there's more out there, lands richer still." The men murmured, some eager, others hesitant. Eric looked at the faces around the fire, Halvar's eager eyes, Leif's quiet doubt, Olaf's weary frown. The smell of roasted fish filled the air, its smoky tang a comfort, but Eric felt the tension beneath it. They had survived the sea, the raids, the loss of Gunnar. But what lay ahead? Would they return as heroes, or would the foreign lands claim more of them? The fire died to embers, the night air cold against Eric's skin. He clutched the bracelet, its runes a mystery he couldn't yet read. Tomorrow they would sail again, driven by hunger, hope, and the promise of something greater. But the path was uncertain, and the scent of danger lingered on the wind. The sun hung low over the Northumbrian coast, casting a golden sheen across the waves as Eric's fleet sailed south, their drakkars cutting through the water like knives through cloth. It was late spring of 793, and the air was warmer now, laced with the scent of blooming gorse and the faint salt of the sea. The men's faces were weathered, their beards matted with sweat and salt, but their eyes gleamed with the thrill of survival and the weight of their plunder, sacks heavy with silver chalices, gold crosses, and stolen grain. Eric stood at the helm, his hands calloused from the ropes, the bracelet in his pocket a constant reminder of the journey that had begun with a single find. The taste of their last meal lingered, boiled cabbage and smoked fish, the smoky tang clinging to his tongue, a far cry from the barley porridge of home. Their raids had grown bolder, striking villages along the coast, but now they sought a larger prize, a trading settlement rumored to thrive at the mouth of a river. The men whispered of markets where goods from distant lands, silks, spices, and wines, changed hands, carried by ships from places they could scarcely imagine. Eric felt the pull of these tales, the promise of new worlds beyond the horizon. The sea was calmer today, its surface rippling like polished iron, and the rhythmic creak of the oars blended with the men's low hums of Old Norse songs. Halvar's voice rose above the rest, singing of Freya's golden tears, his youthful energy a spark among the weary crew. Yet beneath the song, Eric sensed a shift. Their journey was no longer just about survival. It was about discovery, a collision of worlds. They reached the settlement by midday, a cluster of wooden and stone buildings huddled along the riverbank, where the air was thick with the smells of baking bread, tanning leather, and the sharp tang of fermenting ale. The market bustled with life. Merchants in colourful tunics hawked their wares, their voices rising in a language Eric didn't understand, sharp and guttural compared to the flowing cadence of Norse. Stalls overflowed with goods, amber beads from the Baltic, pottery glazed in deep blues and greens, and strange fruits that smelled sweet and unfamiliar. Eric's crew tethered their ships to a wooden dock, the planks slick with river mud, and stepped into this new world, their axes hidden beneath cloaks but ready. The locals stared, their eyes wary, noting the strangers' rough woolen tunics, braided hair, and the glint of iron at their belts. Thorstein, ever the leader, approached a merchant, a stout man with a red face and a cloak dyed a deep crimson. The man spoke in halting Norse, learned from traders, and offered a horn of ale, its frothy bitterness a welcome change from the stale water of the voyage. Eric sipped cautiously, the drink warming his chest, and listened as Thorstein bartered. They traded a silver chalice from Lindisfarne for a sack of wheat, a bolt of fine linen, and a small jar of a strange, fragrant powder the merchant called pepper. Eric sniffed it, the sharp, earthy scent stinging his nose, unlike anything he'd known. "From lands far south," the merchant said, his eyes gleaming with pride. "Worth more than gold." Eric doubted that, but the encounter stirred something in him, a sense of worlds vast and varied, where men lived differently, ate differently, dreamed differently. The crew lingered in the market, their senses overwhelmed. Halvar, wide-eyed, traded a stolen brooch for a small cake of honey and oats, its sweetness bursting on his tongue as he shared it with Leif. The older man chewed slowly, his face softening for the first time in days. "This is what wealth tastes like," Leif murmured, and Eric smiled, though his mind drifted to Inga, who would have loved the cake's golden warmth. The market was a tapestry of cultures. A woman in a green shawl sang a lilting tune, her voice high and clear, unlike the deep sagas of home. A man in a hooded cloak carved wood into intricate shapes, his tools finer than any Eric had seen. The air buzzed with languages, some soft, some harsh, blending with the clink of coins and the bleat of goats. Eric felt like a child again, wide-eyed at a skald's tale, but this was real, a world unfolding before him. Yet the encounter wasn't all wonder. Some locals were hostile, their eyes narrowing at the Norse strangers. A merchant spat as Thorstein passed, muttering something about heathen raiders. Eric's hand drifted to his axe, but Thorstein's sharp glance stayed him. "We trade today, not fight," the Jarl said, his voice low. They bought more supplies, barrels of ale, sacks of barley, and dried apples that crunched with a tart sweetness. Eric noticed the locals' clothing, tunics dyed in vibrant hues, unlike the drab wool of home, and belts adorned with bronze buckles. He wondered what Inga would think of such finery, her hands used to weaving coarse cloth by the firelight, the scent of wool and smoke filling their hut. As evening fell, the crew camped by the river, their fire casting flickering shadows on the water. They roasted a stolen pig, its fat sizzling and popping, filling the air with a rich, savory aroma that drew curious glances from passing locals. The meat was tender, a luxury after weeks of tough rations, and the men ate greedily, their laughter loud under the starlit sky. Halvar tried to mimic the local song he'd heard, his voice stumbling over the unfamiliar melody, and the men roared with amusement. Eric joined in, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on the clash of worlds they'd witnessed. The locals' guard, their crosses, their songs, they were so different, yet their hunger, their joy, felt familiar. He chewed a piece of pork, its juices warm on his tongue, and wondered if these people, too, told stories of heroes by their fires. The next day, they met a group of traders from a land called Francia. Their ship docked further down the river. The Franks were tall, their hair cropped short, their cloaks fastened with silver pins shaped like crosses. Their leader, a man named Roland, spoke Norse fluently, his accent sharp but clear. He offered wine, poured from a clay jug, its taste sharp and fruity, unlike the honeyed mead of home. Eric sipped it, the warmth spreading through him, and listened as Roland spoke of his homeland. Cities of stone, markets 10 times the size of this one, and a king who ruled with iron and faith. "Your raids stir trouble," Roland warned, his eyes serious. "The Saxons will arm themselves. You've woken a sleeping bear." Thorstein laughed, but Eric felt a chill, the wine souring on his tongue. The bracelet in his pocket felt heavier, a symbol not just of wealth but of consequences. The encounter with the Franks deepened the cultural tapestry. Roland shared a meal with them, offering bread studded with seeds that popped between Eric's teeth, its crust crisp and warm. In return, the Norse offered dried cod, its salty toughness a stark contrast. Roland grimaced but ate politely, and Eric noticed how the act of sharing food bridged their differences, if only for a moment. The Franks sang a hymn, their voices low and solemn, praising their god. Halvar, curious, asked about the words, and Roland explained, his hands tracing the shape of a cross in the air. Eric listened, intrigued but wary, his mind drifting to Odin's ravens, the gods of his people. The clash of beliefs was subtle but real, like the difference between the Franks' wine and Norse mead. As they prepared to leave, Eric traded a stolen silver ring for a small wooden figure carved by a local artisan, a horse, its lines smooth and lifelike. He tucked it into his sack, thinking of his sons, who would marvel at its craftsmanship. The market had changed him, broadened his view of the world. He saw it in the men, too, Halvar's eagerness to learn the local songs, Leif's quiet fascination with their tools. Even old Olaf, usually grumbling, fingered a piece of dyed cloth, its blue vibrant against his weathered hands. The air was rich with possibility, but also tension. They were strangers here, their presence a spark that could ignite conflict. That night, by the fire, the men shared stories of what they'd seen. Halvar described a woman's shawl, woven with threads that shimmered like water. Leif spoke of a blacksmith's forge, its heat and sparks unlike their simple anvils. Eric listened, the fire's warmth easing the ache in his shoulders, the smell of burning pine grounding him. But he also heard whispers of unease. Some locals had watched them too closely, their hands on knives. The raid on Lindisfarne had spread fear, and the Norse were no longer unseen shadows. Eric felt the weight of their actions, the bracelet a reminder of how one act could ripple outward, touching lives far beyond their own. As they sailed away, the river settlement fading into the mist, Eric stood at the prow, the wind carrying the scent of salt and distant rain. The men were quieter now, their sacks heavier, their minds full of new sights and sounds. They had tasted foreign foods, heard alien songs, and seen a world richer and stranger than their own. But they had also stirred something, a ripple of fear, a whisper of retribution. The cultural encounters had enriched them, but they had also marked them as outsiders, hunters in a land that might soon hunt back. The sea stretched ahead, its waves whispering of new shores, new clashes. Eric clutched the wooden horse, its smooth curves a promise to his sons, and wondered what the next encounter would bring. Would they find allies or enemies? The bracelet, cold against his skin, held no answers, but its weight promised more than gold. It promised a story yet to unfold. The sea grew restless as Eric's fleet sailed further south along the Northumbrian coast, the waves churning under a sky bruised with heavy clouds. It was early summer of 793, and the air carried a damp chill, mingled with a sharp bite of salt and the faint, acrid scent of distant smoke. Eric stood at the prow of his draka, his hands gripping the dragon-carved figurehead, the wood slick from sea spray. His woolen cloak clung to his shoulders, heavy with damp, and the bracelet in his pocket felt like a stone, its weight a reminder of the journey that had begun with a single find. The taste of their last meal, stolen barley porridge mixed with sour apples, eaten cold under a drizzling sky, sat heavy in his stomach, a stark contrast to the warm hearth meals of home. The men were weary, their faces gaunt from weeks of raiding, their hands blistered from oars and axes. Yet the promise of more plunder drove them onward, a fire that burned despite the growing shadows. The raids had become routine, a rhythm of strike and retreat, but each one left a mark on Eric's soul. The thrill of Lindisfarne's riches had faded, replaced by the grim reality of their actions. The men spoke less of glory now, their voices hushed, their eyes scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. The air was thick with tension, the scent of rain mingling with the metallic tang of sharpened blades. Eric felt it too, a gnawing unease that their luck, like the summer's fleeting warmth, might soon run out. The bracelet, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a chain, tying them to a path of increasing peril. Their next target was a small village nestled in a wooded valley, its thatched roofs barely visible through the trees. The men approached at dusk, the sky a deep indigo streaked with crimson, the air heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. They moved silently, their boots sinking into the soft forest floor, the crunch of leaves muffled by the evening mist. Eric's heart pounded, not with the excitement of earlier raids, but with a dread he couldn't name. The village was quiet, too quiet, the only sound the distant hoot of an owl and the faint crackle of a hearth fire. Thorstein signaled the attack, and the men surged forward, axes raised, their shouts shattering the stillness. But this time, the village was ready. Men emerged from the shadows, armed with spears and pitchforks, their faces hardened with resolve. The clash was brutal, the air filled with the clang of iron, the thud of wood, and the sickening crunch of bone. Eric swung his axe, its weight familiar in his hands, but his strikes lacked the fervor of before. A young man, no older than Halvar, lunged at him with a spear, his eyes wide with fear and defiance. Eric parried, the spear grazing his arm, leaving a hot sting and a trickle of blood. He knocked the man down, sparing his life, but the memory of those eyes haunted him as they retreated, their sacks only half filled with grain and a few iron tools. The village burned behind them, the smoke rising like a dark prayer, its acrid stench clinging to their clothes. The cost of the raid was heavy. Leif took a spear to the thigh, his blood soaking the forest floor, the metallic scent mixing with the pine. Eric bound the wound with a strip of linen, the fabric quickly turning crimson, and helped Leif to the ship. The older man's face was pale, his breath shallow, but he managed a grim smile. "I've seen worse," he rasped, though his eyes betrayed his pain. Back at the ships, they lit a fire on the beach, the flames struggling against the damp wood, sending up plumes of smoke that stung Eric's eyes. They boiled stolen oats, the porridge thin and tasteless, but it warmed their hands as they ate in silence. The scent of burning wood and sea salt was a bitter comfort, a reminder of home, but also of the blood they'd spilled. Hunger was their constant companion now. The stolen food, barley, apples, and the occasional slab of smoked meat, was never enough. Eric rationed carefully, his own stomach growling as he gave extra portions to the wounded. The men's faces grew leaner, their eyes hollow, their laughter replaced by grumbles. Old Olaf, his hands trembling, spoke of curses. "The gods are angry," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the waves. "We've taken too much, given nothing back." Eric wanted to argue, to point to the treasures in their hold, but the words stuck in his throat. The bracelet felt colder now, its runes a warning he couldn't decipher. Deception crept into their ranks, a shadow darker than hunger. One night, as they camped on a rocky shore, the air thick with the smell of seaweed and burning driftwood, Eric caught Halvar slipping extra bread from the rations. The young man's face flushed with shame, but his eyes were defiant. "I was hungry," he said, his voice low. Eric's hand twitched toward his axe, but he stayed it, remembering Halvar's bravery in the raids. "We all are," Eric said, his voice steady but heavy. He divided the bread among the men, their hands grabbing eagerly, the crusts crumbling under their fingers. The incident passed, but trust frayed, each man watching the others, their hunger breeding suspicion. The sea itself turned against them. A storm hit 2 days later, the sky black as coal, the wind howling like a wounded beast. Waves crashed over the drakkars, soaking the men in icy water that stung like needles. Eric tied himself to the mast, shouting orders over the roar, his voice raw. Hold the oars. Secure the sails. The men struggled, their hands slipping on wet wood, their faces grim with fear. Lightning illuminated the dragon prows, their carved eyes seeming to glare at the sea. Thorstein's ship took the worst of it, a wave splintering its hull, sending barrels of water and grain into the depths. They salvaged what they could, the men diving into the freezing water, their breaths gasping as they hauled up sodden sacks. The loss was a blow, the air heavy with the scent of wet wool and despair. On shore, they assessed the damage. Thorstein's face was grim, his beard dripping with seawater, his eyes hollow. "We've lost half our food," he said, his voice flat. The men sat around a meager fire, the flames barely warming their hands, the smell of damp wood and salt a constant reminder of their fragility. They ate what remained, soggy bread and a few strips of dried fish, the taste bitter and gritty. Eric felt the weight of leadership, his decisions now a matter of life and death. He thought of Inga, her hands kneading dough by the fire, the scent of barley bread filling their hut. Would he ever see her again, or would the sea claim him as it had so many others? The dark side of their journey wasn't just hunger or storms, it was the cost of their actions. Word of their raids had spread, carried by fleeing villagers and traders. One evening, as they anchored in a quiet cove, the air heavy with the scent of pine and distant smoke, a small boat approached. Its occupant, an old man with a face like weathered leather, shouted in broken Norse. "You've cursed us," he cried, his voice trembling with rage. "Our fields burn, our children starve." Eric's heart sank, the man's words echoing Olaf's fears. They had taken to survive, but at what cost? The old man rode away, his curses fading into the night, leaving Eric staring at the dark water, the bracelet heavy in his pocket. Internal conflicts flared. Halvar and another man, Bjorn, argued over a stolen silver cup, their voices rising over the crackle of the fire. Bjorn accused Halvar of hoarding, his hand on his knife. Eric stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "We fight the sea, not each other," he said, but the tension lingered, the air thick with mistrust. The men were tired, their bodies worn, their spirits frayed. Eric felt it too, the weight of every decision, every life lost. Gunnar's death still haunted him, the memory of his fevered brow and weak voice a constant shadow. He wondered if Inga would recognize the man he was becoming, hardened by blood and hunger. Yet amidst the darkness, there were flickers of light. One night, as they camped on a wind-swept cliff, the sky clear and studded with stars, Leif shared a story. His voice, usually quiet, carried the rhythm of a skald, telling of a time he'd fished with his father, the air filled with the scent of salt and herring. The men listened, their faces softening, the fire's warmth easing their aches. Eric shared a memory of his sons, their laughter as they chased sheep, the smell of wet wool and grass. The stories were a lifeline, binding them to home, to hope. They ate a thin stew of stolen barley and herbs, its warmth a small comfort, the minty tang lingering on their tongues. As they sailed on, the coast grew wilder, the cliffs sharper, the air colder. They raided when they could, but the villages were emptier now, their hearths cold, their fields trampled. The scent of charred wood followed them, a reminder of the destruction they'd left behind. Eric's crew grew leaner, their eyes haunted, their hands trembling as they rowed. The bracelet, once a spark of adventure, now felt like a curse, its runes whispering of choices made and prices paid. Eric thought of the old man's curses, of the blood on his axe, of the faces of those they'd left behind. Were they heroes or monsters? One evening, as they anchored in a sheltered bay, the air heavy with the scent of salt and seaweed, Thorstein called a council. The fire cast long shadows, its crackle the only sound beyond the waves. "We've taken much," he said, his voice heavy. But the cost is high. We must decide, return home, or push deeper. The men were silent, their faces etched with exhaustion and doubt. Eric looked at Halvar, his youthful fire dimmed, at Leif, his wound slowing him, at Olaf, his eyes fixed on the sea. The smell of burning wood and fish filled the air, a faint echo of home, but the path ahead was shrouded in shadow. The bracelet burned in Eric's pocket, a question unanswered. Could they outrun the darkness they'd sown, or would it consume them? The Northumbrian coast faded into the mist as Eric's fleet turned northward, their drakkars slicing through the grey waves under a sky heavy with the promise of rain. It was midsummer of 793, and the air carried a damp warmth, laced with the scent of salt and the faint sweetness of blooming heather from distant shores. Eric stood at the helm, his hands rough from weeks of gripping ropes, his cloak stiff with dried seawater. The bracelet in his pocket, once a spark of adventure, now felt like a tether to a journey that had changed him. The taste of their last meal, a thin stew of stolen barley and wilted herbs, its minty tang faint on his tongue, reminded him of how far they'd come from the hearty mutton stews of home. The men were weary, their faces etched with hunger and the weight of their deeds, yet a new purpose stirred among them, to build something lasting from the chaos of their raids. The raids had taken their toll. Gunnar's death, Leif's wound, the loss of provisions in the storm, but they had also brought wealth. The ship's holds were heavy with silver, gold, and grain, enough to transform their village if they could return. But the sea was unforgiving, and the lands they'd plundered were growing hostile. Thorstein, his grey beard flecked with salt, had proposed a new plan: find a place to winter, a temporary haven where they could repair their ships, heal their wounded, and forge a community strong enough to withstand the challenges ahead. Eric felt the weight of this idea, a shift from raiding to rooting, however briefly. The men murmured agreement, their voices low over the creak of oars, the scent of tar and wet wood filling the air. They found their haven on a small island off the coast, its cliffs rising like sentinels against the sea. The air was sharp with the smell of guano and seaweed, but the island offered shelter, a sandy cove for the ships, a freshwater stream gurgling through mossy rocks, and a forested ridge thick with pine and birch. The men disembarked, their boots sinking into the soft sand, the crunch of shells underfoot a welcome change from the ship's swaying deck. Eric inhaled deeply, the earthy scent of damp soil and pine resin grounding him. They set to work, their axes ringing against the trees, the air filled with the sweet smell of fresh-cut wood. They built shelters, simple lean-tos of branches and sailcloth, their interiors smelling of sap and sea. The work was hard, but it brought a rhythm, a sense of purpose that had been missing since the raids began. The first night on the island, they lit a great fire on the beach, its flames roaring against the darkness, sending up sparks that danced like stars. They roasted a deer they'd hunted, its fat sizzling and dripping into the fire, filling the air with a rich, savory aroma that made Eric's mouth water. The meat was tough but warm, a luxury after weeks of meagre rations. They passed around a horn of stolen ale, its bitter froth a faint echo of the mead they'd drunk in Thorstein's hall. The men laughed, their voices louder than they'd been in weeks, the fire's warmth easing the ache in their bones. Halvar, his youthful spirit returning, began a saga, his voice strong over the crackle of the flames. He sang of Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, striking giants, and the men joined in, their voices blending with the distant crash of waves. Eric felt a spark of hope, the song a thread tying them to home, to each other. The days settled into a routine. The men repaired the ships, their hands sticky with tar as they sealed cracked planks, the sharp scent mingling with the sea air. They fished in the cove, hauling up cod and mackerel, their scales glinting silver in the sunlight. The fish were gutted and smoked over fires of green wood, the smoky tang clinging to their clothes. Eric helped Leif, whose wound was healing slowly, his leg stiff but his spirit steadier. They boiled herbs, mint and chamomile stolen from a village, for a tea that soothed Leif's pain, its warm, grassy scent a small comfort. Meals were simple but communal. Smoked fish, boiled roots, and flatbread baked on hot stones, its crust crisp and slightly charred. The act of eating together, the clink of wooden bowls, the shared warmth of the fire, forged bonds stronger than the raids ever had. A community began to form, fragile but real. The men divided tasks. Some hunted, their bows silent in the forest, returning with rabbits or small deer, their blood staining the earth. Others gathered wood, their axes echoing through the trees. A few, like old Olaf, wove nets from flax, their hands nimble despite their age. Olaf's grumbling softened. His prayers to Njord now laced with thanks for the island's shelter. Eric organized the work, his voice calm but firm, his role as leader settling more naturally now. He thought of Inga, her hands weaving by the fire, the smell of wool and smoke in their hut. Would she recognize this man, building a fleeting home on a foreign shore? The island wasn't empty. A small group of locals, fisherfolk who lived in crude huts on the far side, watched warily. Their leader, a weathered woman named Elric, approached one morning, her hair grey and braided, her cloak dyed a faded blue. She spoke a halting mix of Norse and her own tongue, learned from traders, and offered a basket of oysters, their briny scent sharp in the air. In return, Eric gave her a stolen silver brooch, its intricate design glinting in the sun. They shared a meal by the fire, the oysters roasted until their shells popped open, revealing tender flesh that tasted of the sea. Elric's people were cautious but curious, their eyes lingering on the Norse axes and shields. They sang a song, its melody soft and lilting, unlike the bold sagas of home. Halvar tried to mimic it, his voice stumbling but earnest, drawing smiles from the locals. Eric felt a fragile bridge forming, built on shared food and tentative trust. But the darkness of their past lingered. One night, as the fire burned low, its embers glowing like eyes in the dark, Elric told a story. Her voice was steady, her words carrying the weight of loss. "Your people burned our kin's homes," she said, her eyes fixed on Eric. "Fields lie barren, children cry for bread." The air grew heavy, the scent of smoke and fish suddenly oppressive. Eric's heart sank, the bracelet in his pocket a burning weight. He thought of the old man's curses, the blood on his axe, the villages left in flames. "We took to live," he said softly, his voice thick. Elric nodded, but her eyes were hard. "So do we all," she replied. The moment passed, but it left a scar, a reminder that their community was built on stolen ground. The men began to create traditions, small rituals to bind them. Each evening, they gathered by the fire, the air filled with the scent of burning pine and roasted meat. They shared stories, not just sagas, but memories of home. Leif spoke of his daughter's laughter, Halvar of his mother's barley cakes, their sweetness a distant dream. Eric told of his sons, their wooden swords flashing in the sun, the smell of grass and sheep in the air. The stories wove them together, a tapestry of shared hardship and hope. They carved runes into a tree, marking their presence, the sharp scent of sap rising as they worked. They held a feast to honor Thor, sacrificing a rabbit, its blood offered to the gods, the meat shared among them. The ritual felt like home, the fire's warmth a promise of continuity. Yet challenges remained. Food was scarce, the island's resources limited. They rationed carefully, their stomachs growling as they chewed tough fish and bitter roots. One day, a storm swept through, its winds howling, tearing down a shelter and scattering their firewood. The men rebuilt, their hands raw, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. Leif's wound festered, the skin red and hot, and Eric boiled more herbs, their steam sharp and medicinal. The community held, but it was fragile, tested by hunger and the ghosts of their raids. As summer waned, the men spoke of home. The air grew cooler, the scent of autumn leaves carried on the wind. Thorstein called a council, the fire casting long shadows across their faces. "We've built something here," he said, his voice steady. "But winter comes, and we must decide, stay or return." The men were silent, their eyes reflecting the flames. Eric looked at Halvar, his face leaner but stronger, at Leif, his leg healing, at Olaf, his hands steady now. The smell of smoke and sea was a constant, a reminder of their journey. They had forged a community, a flicker of order in the chaos, but the world beyond waited, hostile, uncertain, yet full of possibility. Eric clutched the bracelet, its runes cold against his skin. The island had given them a taste of what they could build, but the cost of their raids loomed. Would they carry this fragile community home, or would the darkness they'd sown follow them? The fire crackled, the waves whispered, and the story of their journey hung in the balance. The winds of late summer carried a sharp chill as Eric's fleet prepared to depart the island haven, their drakkars anchored in the quiet cove, their dragon prows gleaming faintly under a sky streaked with clouds of ash and amber. It was August of 793, and the air was heavy with the scent of seaweed, pine, and the faint musk of damp earth from the island's forested ridge. Eric stood on the shore, his boots sinking into the sand, the crunch of shells underfoot a familiar sound after weeks of building a fragile community here. His cloak, patched and stiff with salt, hung heavy on his shoulders, and the bracelet in his pocket, its runes worn smooth from constant handling, felt like both a talisman and a burden. The taste of their last meal lingered, smoked mackerel, its oily richness cut by the bitter tang of boiled nettles, a far cry from the hearty mutton stews of his village, where the aroma of roasted meat and barley filled the longhouse. The island had been a respite, a place where the men had forged a fleeting society, bound by shared labor and fireside stories. They had repaired their ships, the sharp scent of tar mingling with the sea air, and hunted deer in the forest, their blood staining the earth, their meat a rare feast. They had shared meals with Elric's fisherfolk, the briny taste of roasted oysters a bridge across their differences. But the weight of their raids, Lindisfarne's plundered gold, the burned villages, the blood on their axes, hung over them like a storm cloud. Eric felt it in the men's silence, in the way Halvar's youthful bravado had quieted, in Leif's slow healing wound, in old Olaf's prayers to Njord, whispered over the waves. The bracelet, that spark from a distant shore, had led them to riches but also to a reckoning. As they prepared to sail, Eric reflected on what their journey had wrought. The raids had brought wealth, silver chalices, gold crosses, sacks of grain, that could transform their village, fill bellies through the harsh winters, and buy tools to work the stubborn land. But they had also sown fear, their names cursed in villages across Northumbria. The old man's words in the cove, "You've cursed us," echoed in Eric's mind, mingling with the scent of charred wood from burned homes. He thought of Inga, her hands kneading dough by the fire, the smell of barley bread a distant memory. Would she see him as a hero, returning with treasures, or a stranger, hardened by blood and loss? The bracelet, once a symbol of adventure, now carried the weight of choices made, lives taken, and futures altered. The men gathered on the beach, their faces lean but resolute, their hands rough from building shelters and mending sails. The fire they lit was smaller now, its flames struggling against the damp wind, sending up sparks that mingled with the salt air. They ate a final meal on the island, smoked fish and flatbread, the crust charred and crisp, the fish's smoky tang a reminder of their survival. Thorstein stood, his grey beard catching the firelight, and spoke of their legacy. "We've taken from this land," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "But we've also built, here, among ourselves. We carry more than gold home. We carry stories, strength, a name that will echo." The men nodded, their eyes reflecting the flames, but Eric saw doubt in some, Leif's furrowed brow, Olaf's distant gaze. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and sea, a blend of home and exile. The island had changed them. They had carved runes into a tree, marking their presence, the sharp scent of sap rising as they worked. They had held a feast for Thor, sacrificing a rabbit, its blood offered to the gods, its meat shared in a ritual that felt like home. They had laughed, sung sagas, and shared memories of loved ones. Halvar's mother's barley cakes, Leif's daughter's laughter, Eric's sons chasing sheep through the grass. These moments had woven them into a community, fragile but real, a flicker of order in the chaos of their raids. But the cost was undeniable. Gunnar's death, Leif's wound, the mistrust that had crept among them, Halvar's stolen bread, Bjorn's accusations, were scars that would not fade. Eric felt them all. His leadership a mantle grown heavier with each loss. The encounter with Elric's people had left its mark too. Their shared meal, the oyster's briny warmth, had been a moment of connection, but her words, "Fields lie barren, children cry for bread," had cut deeper than any spear. Eric saw it now. Their raids had rippled outward, reshaping not just their own lives but those of countless others. Villages burned, families fled, and the Norse were no longer shadows but a force feared across the coast. The bracelet, found on a quiet shore, had sparked a movement, a tide of ambition that had spread to other fjords. Traders carried tales of their deeds, and Eric knew more ships were being built, more men dreaming of glory. Their legacy was not just gold but a shift in the world, a new era of exploration and conquest. As they loaded the ships, the men moved with purpose, their hands steady despite their weariness. They packed the stolen treasures, chalices, crosses, jewels, alongside sacks of grain and barrels of ale, their sour tang a promise of sustenance. The ship's hold smelled of tar and damp wood, a reminder of the sea that awaited. Eric helped Leif aboard, his legs still stiff but stronger, the scent of chamomile from his poultice lingering in the air. Halvar, his face leaner but his eyes bright, tied down the sails, the coarse linen snapping in the wind. Olaf, his hands steady now, checked the ropes, muttering prayers to Njord. The community they'd built, however fleeting, had given them strength, a shared purpose that would carry them home. But the journey back was fraught with peril. The sea grew rough, its waves crashing against the hulls, the air heavy with the scent of salt and storm. One night, a squall hit, the sky black as pitch, the wind howling like a pack of wolves. Eric tied himself to the mast, shouting orders over the roar, his voice raw. "Hold the oars! Keep the sails tight!" The men obeyed, their hands slipping on wet wood, their faces grim with fear. Lightning cracked, illuminating the dragon prows, their carved eyes seeming to defy the sea. The storm spared them, but it left the men shaken, their clothes soaked, the taste of salt on their lips. They ate cold rations, soggy bread and dried fish, the taste gritty and bitter, huddled under furs, the fire a distant memory. The legacy of their journey was taking shape, not just in the treasures they carried, but in the stories they would tell. Eric imagined the Skalds in their village, their voices rising in the longhouse, the air thick with the smell of mead and smoke. They would sing of Lindisfarne, of the market's vibrant colours, of Elric's oysters and the storm's wrath. They would sing of Gunnar's sacrifice, of Leif's courage, of Halvar's growth from boy to man. Eric's name would be among them, tied to the bracelet that had sparked it all. But what would the songs say? Would they call him a hero, or a bringer of ruin? He thought of Inga, her eyes searching his, the scent of her hair, salt and herbs, a tether to home. As they neared their fjord, the air grew colder, the scent of pine and snow replacing the heather and seaweed of foreign shores. The men's spirits lifted, their voices rising in a saga of homecoming, the melody strong despite their weariness. Eric stood at the prow, the bracelet in his hand, its runes catching the weak sunlight. The journey had changed their world, not just their village, but the Norse lands. The raids had sparked a hunger for exploration, a legacy that would send more ships across the sea, seeking riches, forging new paths. The economy of their village would shift, gold and grain replacing barren winters. The culture, too, would bear the marks of their travels. the songs of foreign lands, the taste of pepper, the carved horse Eric carried for his sons. But the legacy was bittersweet. The villages they'd burned, the lives they'd taken, would not be forgotten. The Norse were now a name whispered in fear, their sails a shadow on the horizon. Eric felt the weight of this, the bracelet a reminder of the cost. He thought of Elric, of the old man's curses, of the young man he'd spared, his eyes wide with fear. Their actions had reshaped the world, but at what price? The community they'd built on the island, the bonds forged by fire and hardship, would carry them home, but the scars would remain. The fjord appeared on the horizon, its cliffs sharp against the sky, the air filled with the scent of home, pine, smoke, and the faint sweetness of grass. The men cheered, their voices hoarse but joyful, the oars dipping faster. Eric clutched the bracelet, its runes a story yet to be fully told. They had survived, built, and changed, but the legacy of their journey was only beginning. What would they find at home, and what new paths would open? The sea whispered, the wind carried their story, and the future waited, as vast and uncertain as the waves. The fjord loomed before Eric's fleet, its cliffs rising like ancient guardians under a sky heavy with the first snowflakes of autumn 793. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine, frost, and the faint smoke of distant hearths, a stark contrast to the briny tang of the Northumbrian coast. Eric stood at the prow of his drakkar, his hands gripping the dragon-carved figurehead, its wood worn smooth by months at sea. His cloak, tattered and salt-stained, flapped in the wind, and the bracelet in his pocket, its runes now as familiar as his own heartbeat, felt both heavy and light, a symbol of the journey's beginning and its end. The taste of their last meal lingered, a thin porridge of stolen barley, flavoured with dried herbs, eaten cold as the men conserved their dwindling firewood. The crew was weary, their faces gaunt, their hands scarred from oars and axes, but their eyes burned with the anticipation of home. The journey had transformed them. The raids on Lindisfarne and beyond had filled their holds with silver chalices, gold crosses, and sacks of grain, treasures that could banish the hunger of past winters. But the cost was etched in their souls. Gunnar's death, Leif's limp, the mistrust that had crept among them, and the curses of those they'd left behind. Eric thought of Inga, her hands weaving by the fire, the smell of wool and barley bread filling their hut. Would she recognize the man returning to her, hardened by blood, softened by reflection? The bracelet, found on a quiet shore, had sparked a saga that had reshaped their world, but its final chapter was yet to be written. As the drakkars glided into the fjord, the water mirror-smooth, the men's voices rose in a saga of homecoming, their melody hoarse but strong. The cliffs echoed their song, blending with the distant bleat of sheep and the crackle of village fires. The village came into view, long houses huddled against the hills, their sod roofs dusted with snow, smoke curling upward like a prayer. Eric's heart leapt at the sight, the scent of pine and smoke a tether to his past. The men rowed faster, their oars dipping in rhythm, their breaths visible in the cold air. Halvar, his youthful fire tempered by hardship, grinned at Eric, his eyes bright. Leif, leaning on a makeshift crutch, nodded silently, his wound a badge of survival. Old Olaf, his hands steady now, muttered thanks to Njord, the sea guard who had spared them. They docked at the pebbled shore, the crunch of stones underfoot a sound Eric had dreamed of for months. The villagers gathered, their faces a mix of joy and disbelief, their voices rising in shouts and laughter. Inga stood at the forefront, her blue eyes wide, her hair braided with the same herbs whose scent, lavender and rosemary, had haunted Eric's dreams. She ran to him, her arms wrapping around him, her warmth cutting through the chill of his cloak. The smell of her, salt and herbs, was home itself. Their sons, now taller, clung to his legs, their small hands clutching the wooden horse he traded for in the market, its smooth curves a treasure from a distant world. "You're back," Inga whispered, her voice trembling, her tears warm on his cheek. Eric held her close, the bracelet in his pocket a silent witness to all they'd endured. The village buzzed with life as the men unloaded their treasures. The air filled with the clink of silver, the rustle of grain sacks, and the sour tang of stolen ale poured into horns. The longhouse was a riot of smells: roasted mutton, fresh-baked barley bread, and the smoky warmth of the hearth. The villagers marvelled at the spoils: chalices glinting in the firelight, linen finer than their coarse wool, a jar of pepper whose sharp scent drew gasps. Eric's sons sniffed it, sneezing and laughing, their joy a balm to his weary heart. The women, led by Inga, prepared a feast, the air thick with the aroma of stewed roots and meat, a richness the village hadn't known in years. The men ate greedily, the flavors bursting on their tongues, the warmth spreading through their bodies. That night, the longhouse glowed with firelight, the walls adorned with shields and the spoils of their journey. A skald stood, his voice rising in a saga that wove their tale: the bracelet found on the shore, the raids on Lindisfarne, the market's vibrant colors, Elric's oysters, the storms that tested them. He sang of Gunnar's sacrifice, of Leif's courage, of Halvar's growth, and of Eric, the farmer who became a leader. The villagers listened, their faces rapt, the air heavy with mead and smoke. Eric held Inga's hand, her fingers warm, and felt the weight of the saga settle on him. The bracelet, now on a cord around his neck, caught the firelight, its runes a story told and retold. But the homecoming wasn't all joy. The village had changed in their absence. Hunger had claimed elders, the winter harsh without the men to hunt or fish. Inga spoke of lean days, of children eating thin gruel, the taste bitter with ash. The treasures they'd brought would ease the next winter, but the scars of scarcity lingered. Some villagers looked at Eric's crew with unease, whispers of their raids spreading like ripples. "They burned homes," one woman muttered, her eyes hard. "They brought gold, but at what cost?" Eric heard her, the words echoing Elric's accusations, the old man's curses. He thought of the young man he'd spared, his eyes wide with fear, and wondered if mercy could balance the blood on his hands. The community rebuilt, drawing on the strength they'd forged on the island. The men shared their skills. Halvar taught the boys to carve runes, the scent of sap rising as they worked. Leif, despite his limp, showed the fishermen new knots learned from Elric's people, the flax rough under their fingers. Eric and Thorstein planned for the future, their voices low by the fire, the smell of smoke and mead grounding them. They would use the gold to buy iron tools, the grain to plant richer fields. The village would grow, its economy transformed by the spoils, its culture enriched by tales of distant lands, the taste of pepper, the songs of Francia, the carved horse that Eric's sons passed between them. Yet transformation came with tension. Some men, emboldened by the raids, spoke of sailing again, their eyes gleaming with greed. Others, like Olaf, urged caution, their prayers to the gods now pleas for peace. Eric felt the divide. His role as leader tested anew. He stood one evening by the fjord, the water reflecting the stars, the air cold and sharp with pine. Inga joined him, her hand on his arm, her scent a comfort. "You've changed them," she said softly. "The village, the men, yourself." Eric nodded, the bracelet heavy against his chest. "But have I changed us for better or worse?" he asked, his voice low. Inga's eyes held his, steady and sure. "You brought them home," she said. "That's enough for now." The legacy of their journey took root. The skalds sang of their deeds, their voices carrying to other fjords, sparking new voyages. Traders arrived, their horses laden with furs and amber, drawn by tales of the bracelet and the riches it had led to. The village grew, its longhouses expanding, the air filled with the sounds of hammers and laughter. Eric's sons played with the wooden horse, their voices mimicking the skalds, their dreams shaped by their father's saga. The economy shifted. Gold bought tools, grain filled bellies, and the village thrived. The culture, too, bore the marks of their travels. Inga wove linen from the market, its texture finer than wool. The women sprinkled pepper in their stews, its sharp bite a new tradition. But the transformation was bittersweet. The Norse were now a name feared across the seas, their sails a shadow on foreign shores. Eric knew their raids had changed the world, not just their own. Villages in Northumbria rebuilt, but with walls higher, men armed. The ripples of the bracelet's find had spread, a tide of ambition and conflict that would shape years to come. Eric felt it in the quiet moments, by the fire or the fjord, the bracelet a reminder of the cost. He thought of Elric, of the old man, of the lives left in ashes. Their legacy was wealth and glory, but also loss and fear. As winter approached, the village prepared, the air thick with the scent of snow and smoke. Eric stood with his sons, teaching them to fish, the cold water numbing their hands, the smell of herring sharp in the air. He gave them the bracelet, its runes a mystery they'd one day unravel. "This started it all," he said, his voice steady. "Carry it wisely." They nodded, their eyes wide, the weight of their father's story settling on them. The village glowed with firelight, the saga of their journey a flame that would burn for generations. The sea whispered beyond the fjord, its waves carrying the promise of new voyages, new stories. Eric held Inga close, the scent of her hair grounding him, and knew their transformation was complete. They were no longer just farmers and fishermen. They were a people of the sea, their legacy written in gold, blood, and the runes of a bracelet found on a quiet shore.